The candles have burned down to stubs. Catherine Howard is 19 years old, and she can hear footsteps approaching her chamber at Hampton Court, footsteps that do not belong to her ladies-in-waiting, do not belong to servants bringing food or fresh linens, do not belong to anyone who should be walking these corridors at 11 o'clock at night. She was, until approximately 6 hours ago, Queen of England, wife of Henry VIII, the most powerful woman in the kingdom, a girl who had risen from obscure poverty to wear the crown that Anne Boleyn had died for and Jane Seymour had died wearing. Now she sits in her private chamber, forbidden to leave, surrounded by guards who will not meet her eyes, waiting for something she does not yet fully understand. The king has not come to see her. The king has not sent word. The king, her husband of 16 months, the man who called her his rose without a thorn, the man who showered her with jewels and praised her beauty to every ambassador in Europe, has locked himself in his own chambers and has been weeping for hours. She knows this because she can hear him. The royal apartments at Hampton Court are connected. Sound carries through walls that were built for grandeur rather than privacy. And Henry Tudor, King of England, is sobbing like a child who has discovered that the world is not what he believed it to be. The footsteps stop outside her door. A knock, formal, official, the knock of someone delivering news that cannot be avoided. "Enter," she says, and her voice does not tremble. She has learned, in 16 months, as queen, to control her voice even when her heart is racing. The door opens. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer stands in the entrance, his face arranged in an expression of pastoral concern that does not reach his eyes. Behind him, she can see guards, more guards than should be necessary for a simple visit from the Archbishop of Canterbury. "Your Majesty," Cranmer says, and the title sounds different in his mouth than it did this morning. This morning it was acknowledgement. Now it sounds like accusation. "I come on the king's business. There are matters that must be discussed. At this hour, the matters are urgent. They concern your conduct before your marriage to His Majesty, and during it." The words land like stones dropped into still water. She feels the ripples spreading outward, feels the implications settling into her understanding. Someone has talked. Someone has told. And everything she has built, everything she has survived to achieve, is about to collapse. What you are about to learn is the true story of Catherine Howard's destruction, not the execution itself, which took only seconds, but the 3 months of psychological torture that preceded it. The historians who documented Catherine Howard's fall focused on the charges adultery, treason, the betrayal of a king who had loved her. They recorded the dates of arrests, the content of confessions, the legal proceedings that transformed a queen into a condemned traitor. But they did not adequately document what those 3 months actually felt like: the isolation, the interrogations, the systematic destruction of everyone she had ever trusted, the experience of watching, day after day, as her world was dismantled piece by piece, while she waited to learn whether she would live or die. Tonight, you will learn what really happened to Catherine Howard. You will learn about the accusations that began her fall, the confessions that were extracted under pressure, the people who betrayed her, and the people who tried to save her. You will learn about the nights at Sion Abbey, the journey to the tower, the final hours before the blade fell. You will learn why what happened before her execution was worse than the execution itself. Subscribe if you want to understand the full horror of being a queen who fell from grace in Tudor England. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Because Catherine Howard is about to face Archbishop Cranmer's questions, and I am going to tell you exactly what those questions revealed and what they cost her. But first, I need to warn you about something. Catherine Howard was probably 19 years old when she died. Some historians believe she was younger, perhaps 17. She was a teenager who had been raised in chaotic circumstances, who had experienced things that no child should experience, who had made choices that Tudor morality condemned, but that modern understanding might view very differently. What happened to her was not justice. It was the systematic annihilation of a young woman who had become inconvenient to powerful men. This is not a story with a happy ending, but it is a story that deserves to be told accurately. Let us begin. To understand what happened to Catherine Howard, you must first understand what happened to her before she became queen. Catherine was born around 1523. The exact date is uncertain, because she was not considered important enough at the time for anyone to record it precisely. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a man perpetually in debt, perpetually seeking patronage, perpetually failing to provide for his large family. Her mother died when Catherine was young. Her father shipped her off to the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where she would be raised with other young relatives, and taught the skills that might help her find a husband someday. The Dowager Duchess's household was, by later accounts, remarkably poorly supervised. Dozens of young people lived there, relatives, wards, servants' children. The girls slept together in a large dormitory called the Maiden's Chamber. At night, when the older women had retired and the household supervision relaxed, things happened in that dormitory that would later destroy Catherine Howard's life. When Catherine was perhaps 13 years old, her music teacher, a man named Henry Manox, began paying her special attention. The attention escalated. Manox later testified that he had touched her intimately, that she had permitted liberties that stopped just short of full intercourse. Whether Catherine understood what was happening, whether she consented in any meaningful sense, whether a 13-year-old can consent to attention from an adult teacher, these questions were not asked by the investigators who later examined the case. What mattered to them was that Catherine Howard had been touched before her marriage to the king. After Manox, there was Francis Dereham. Dereham was a secretary in the Duchess's household, young, attractive, ambitious. He began visiting the Maiden's Chamber at night, along with other young men who had discovered that the dormitory's supervision was inadequate. He and Catherine developed a relationship that was, by all accounts, sexual. They called each other husband and wife. They exchanged gifts. They made plans for a future together. Whether this constituted a binding pre-contract of marriage which would have made Catherine's later marriage to Henry VIII invalid became a crucial legal question. Catherine would later deny that any such contract existed. Dereham would insist that it did. The truth probably lies somewhere in the complexity of a teenage relationship conducted in secret, without adult guidance, between two young people who did not fully understand the implications of their words. What matters for our story is this. By the time Catherine Howard came to the royal court at age 16 or 17, she had a past that powerful people knew about, that servants had witnessed, that could be used against her if anyone chose to investigate. And in November 1541, someone chose to investigate. Now let us return to Hampton Court, where Archbishop Cranmer is about to begin his interrogation. The Archbishop did not come alone. He brought documents, papers, covered in handwriting that Catherine could not read from across the room, but that she suspected contained testimony from people she had known, people she had trusted, people who had apparently decided that their own survival required her destruction. "Your Majesty," Cranmer began, "I must ask you about your time in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, specifically about your relationships with certain men who resided or worked there. I do not understand what you mean." "I think you do." Cranmer's voice remained gentle, pastorally gentle, the tone of a priest hearing confession. "We have received testimony from multiple witnesses, testimony that describes conduct unbecoming of a maid, let alone a queen." "What witnesses?" "I am not at liberty to reveal their names at this time, but their accounts are detailed and consistent. They describe intimate contact between yourself and a man named Henry Manox. They describe a relationship of considerable intimacy with a man named Francis Dereham." He paused. "And they describe more recent conduct, Your Majesty. Conduct that occurred after your marriage to the king. The last sentence struck like a physical blow. Before the marriage was one thing damaging, humiliating, but potentially survivable. The king had married her, believing her to be a virgin. Learning otherwise would wound his pride. But after the marriage, "I have done nothing improper since becoming queen," she said. "The witnesses suggest otherwise. There are accounts of private meetings with the gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a man named Thomas Culpeper." Culpeper. The name hung in the air between them. Thomas Culpeper, who had been kind to her when kindness was rare. Thomas Culpeper, who had looked at her the way Henry had once looked at her, before age and illness had made his affection more possessive than passionate. Thomas Culpeper, with whom she had— "I have had conversations with Master Culpeper," she said carefully, "as I have had conversations with many gentlemen of the court. There is nothing improper in conversation." The conversations were private. They occurred at night. They were facilitated by Lady Rochford, who kept watch while you and Master Culpeper were alone together. Cranmer's gentle tone did not change. "Tell me, Your Majesty, what requires a lookout if there is nothing improper occurring?" She had no answer. There was no answer that would satisfy him. "I will ask you to provide a full account of your conduct," Cranmer continued, "both before your marriage and during it. You may write this account yourself, or you may dictate it to a secretary, but the account must be complete. His Majesty requires complete honesty. And if my account does not match the testimony you have received, then there will be further questions. There are methods for determining truth when accounts conflict." His voice remained gentle, but the implication was clear. Torture was not typically used on women of noble birth. But there were other pressures that could be applied. And everyone she cared about, everyone who had helped her, everyone who had kept her secrets, could be subjected to methods that would make them say whatever the investigators wanted to hear. "I will write my account," she said, "tonight. You will have it by morning. I will wait." Cranmer settled into a chair near the door. He was not leaving. He would watch her write, would take the document directly from her hands, would ensure that she had no opportunity to coordinate her story with anyone else. She was already alone. The isolation had begun. Let me stop here to explain something about Tudor interrogation, because without understanding the system Catherine was facing, you cannot understand what the next 3 months would cost her. When the Tudor state decided to investigate someone, it did not simply ask questions and accept the answers. It conducted a comprehensive examination that sought to uncover every possible fact, implicate every possible associate, construct the most damaging possible interpretation of events. The investigators would begin by gathering testimony from anyone who might have relevant information. Servants, relatives, friends, enemies. Everyone would be questioned. The questioning would be persistent, repeated, designed to catch inconsistencies and contradictions that could be exploited. Those who refused to provide useful testimony faced consequences. Minor figures might be threatened with imprisonment or loss of position. More significant figures could face charges of their own misprision of treason, concealment of information, participation in whatever crimes were being investigated. The system created overwhelming pressure to provide information, even if providing that information meant betraying people you had known and trusted. Once sufficient testimony had been gathered, the principal subjects would be questioned directly. Their accounts would be compared to the testimony already collected. Any discrepancy, any detail that did not match, would be treated as evidence of deception, and deception in matters touching the king's honor was itself a crime. For Catherine Howard, this system meant that her fate depended not only on what she said, but on what everyone else said. And everyone else was being questioned simultaneously, under pressure to reveal everything they knew or suspected, with their own survival depending on their cooperation. The system was designed to produce confessions. It almost always succeeded. Catherine wrote her account that night, with Cranmer watching from across the room. She had to make choices. What to admit, what to deny, what to minimize. She could not know exactly what the witnesses had said, could not coordinate her story with theirs, could not anticipate which details would be verified and which would be challenged. She admitted to Manox. She admitted that he had touched her, that she had permitted liberties that she should not have permitted. She was careful to emphasize that there had been no actual intercourse, a crucial distinction that might affect whether her marriage to the king was considered valid. She admitted to Dereham. She admitted the relationship, the intimacy, the nights in the maiden's chamber when he had visited her bed, but she denied that there had been any pre-contract of marriage. She denied that she had ever promised to marry him. She framed the relationship as something that had happened to her youthful indiscretion, the result of inadequate supervision rather than something she had chosen. And she denied Culpeper. She admitted the meetings she had to, since Lady Rochford and others had witnessed them, but she denied that anything improper had occurred. They had talked, they had exchanged tokens of affection, but there had been no physical intimacy, no betrayal of her marriage vows, no adultery. The denial was her gamble. Adultery after marriage was treason. Treason meant death. If she could maintain that nothing treasonous had occurred with Culpeper, if the meetings could be characterized as indiscreet rather than criminal, she might survive. The gamble depended on Culpeper telling the same story. She would learn, in the days that followed, that Culpeper was not going to tell the same story. The morning after Cranmer's visit, Catherine was moved from her private chambers to a smaller suite elsewhere in Hampton Court. The move was presented as temporary, a change of accommodations while certain matters were resolved, but she understood what it meant. She was being separated from her household, from her servants, from anyone who might help her coordinate her defense. She was permitted to keep a few ladies in waiting, but these women were carefully selected people whose loyalty to the king exceeded their loyalty to her, people who would report every word she spoke, every tear she shed, every moment of despair she displayed. She did not see Henry. She would never see Henry again. What she heard, through the careful silence that surrounded her, was that the king had moved from grief to rage. The weeping she had heard through the walls had given way to fury. Henry was calling for a sword so that he could kill her himself. Henry was announcing that she had been the opposite of everything he believed her to be. Henry was demanding that everyone who had deceived him, everyone who had failed to reveal her past, be hunted down and punished. The investigation expanded daily. The Dowager, Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine's step-grandmother, whose household had been so poorly supervised, was interrogated. Her servants were interrogated. Every person who had lived in that household during the years of Catherine's residence was identified and questioned. Henry Manox was arrested. Francis Dereham was arrested. Thomas Culpeper was arrested. Lady Rochford Jane Boleyn, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, who had served Catherine as lady-in-waiting and had facilitated the meetings with Culpeper, was arrested. One by one, everyone Catherine had ever trusted was taken into custody. One by one, they were questioned under conditions designed to produce whatever answers the investigators wanted. And one by one, they began to talk. The testimony that emerged from these interrogations painted a picture that Catherine could not escape. Manox confirmed the relationship, provided details that Catherine had hoped would remain private, described intimacies that transformed a teenage girl's indiscretion into evidence of a pattern of immoral conduct. Dereham was more damaging. Under questioning and quite possibly under torture, though the records are not explicit, he revealed everything. The nights in the maiden's chamber, the physical intimacy, the terms husband and wife that they had used with each other. He also revealed something Catherine had not admitted, that when he had come to court after her marriage to the king, seeking employment in her household, she had given him a position. She had kept him close. Why would a queen give employment to a former lover unless she intended to resume the relationship? That was the question the investigators asked. That was the interpretation they placed on conduct that might have had other explanations. But the most damaging testimony came from Culpeper. Culpeper had been questioned separately, without knowledge of what Catherine had said in her written account. And Culpeper, facing charges of treason that could result in a hideous death, had not maintained the same denials that Catherine had offered. He admitted to meetings. He admitted to affection. He admitted that, in his own words, he intended and meant to do ill with the Queen, and that in likewise the Queen so minded to do with him. Intention. The word was crucial. Even if nothing physical had occurred, and the investigators were not certain either way, the intention to commit adultery was itself treasonous. Culpeper had confessed to intending what Catherine denied had ever been intended. The stories did not match. And when stories did not match, the investigators assumed the worst. Let me take you now to November 22, 1541, when Catherine Howard learned what her situation had become. She had been held in the smaller suite at Hampton Court for nearly 3 weeks. She had been questioned repeatedly, had provided multiple accounts that attempted to explain her conduct without admitting treason. She had wept, had protested her innocence, had begged for the opportunity to speak with the king directly. The opportunity never came. Instead, on November 22, a delegation arrived to inform her that she was no longer queen. By order of the Privy Council, acting on the king's authority, Catherine Howard was stripped of her royal title. She was no longer Queen of England. She was no longer entitled to the honorifics, the deference, the protections that queenship provided. She was simply Catherine Howard again, the obscure girl from the Dowager Duchess's chaotic household, the nobody who had briefly worn a crown. The delegation also informed her that she was being moved, not to the Tower, not yet, but to Sion Abbey, a former monastery that had been converted to secular use. There she would be held while the investigation continued and her fate was determined. "What will happen to me?" she asked the delegation. No one answered. Perhaps they did not know. Perhaps they did not want to tell her. She was taken from Hampton Court under guard. The journey to Sion was not long. The abbey was located west of London, along the Thames, but it might as well have been a journey to another world. Every mile she traveled took her further from the life she had known, closer to whatever ending awaited her. Sion Abbey became her prison for the next 10 weeks. The accommodations were not uncomfortable. She was given rooms, servants, adequate food, but she was completely isolated. No visitors were permitted. No letters were delivered. No news from the outside world reached her except through the careful filter of her guards and the officials who monitored her imprisonment. She did not know what was happening to the people she cared about. She did not know whether Culpeper was alive or dead, whether Lady Rochford was still being questioned, whether her family was trying to save her or had abandoned her to whatever fate the king decided. What she knew was that each day she survived was a day closer to some resolution. Either she would be pardoned, the king was unpredictable, had shown mercy before, might decide that her youth and foolishness deserved forgiveness, or she would be condemned. The waiting was the worst part. There is a particular kind of torture in uncertainty, in not knowing whether you will live or die, whether the next messenger brings salvation or doom. Catherine spent 10 weeks in that uncertainty, watching the winter days grow shorter, celebrating Christmas in isolation, marking the new year of 1542 with no indication of what that year would bring. And during those 10 weeks, while she waited, things were happening in London that she could not see. On December 1, 1541, Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were tried for treason. The trial was brief. The evidence had already been gathered. The confessions had already been extracted. Both men were found guilty. Both were sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most painful death that English law prescribed. Culpeper, because of his status as a gentleman, was granted a mercy. His sentence was commuted to simple beheading. Dereham, who had no such status, received no mercy. On December 10, 1541, both men were executed at Tyburn. Culpeper died first. He knelt prayed for the king and queen, placed his head on the block. The blade fell. It was over quickly. Dereham's death was slower. He was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still breathing. What followed the disembowelment, the emasculation, the quartering of a still-living body was designed to demonstrate what happened to those who committed treason against the crown. Catherine did not witness these executions, but she learned of them. Someone, a guard, a servant, someone who wanted her to understand what awaited her, made sure she knew how the men who had loved her had died. Their heads were mounted on spikes on London Bridge. They would remain there for months, rotting, a permanent reminder of the cost of loving Catherine Howard. The next 6 weeks passed in a kind of suspended horror. Catherine knew now that her case was considered serious enough to execute men. She knew that whatever mercy the king might have shown in the immediate aftermath of the revelations, whatever grief or lingering affection might have tempered, his rage had given way to something colder and more implacable. But she also knew that she had not yet been formally charged. She had not been tried. The machinery of justice was moving slowly, and every day it did not arrive at her door was another day of survival. She tried to hope. She wrote letters, none of which were delivered, pleading for the opportunity to explain herself, to beg the king's forgiveness, to throw herself on his mercy. She prayed, she waited, and she watched Lady Rochford's fate as a preview of her own. Lady Rochford had been arrested at the same time as Catherine. She had been the intermediary, the facilitator, the person who had kept watch while Catherine and Culpeper met privately. Her guilt, if Catherine was guilty, was unquestionable, but something had broken in Lady Rochford during the interrogations. The pressure, the isolation, the knowledge of what awaited her, something had shattered her mind. By December, she was exhibiting signs of what modern medicine would probably call a psychotic break. She raved, made no coherent sense, could not understand the charges against her or participate in her own defense. English law did not permit the execution of people who were mentally incompetent. If Lady Rochford could not understand why she was being killed, killing her served no purpose. This created a problem for the king. He wanted Lady Rochford dead. He wanted everyone involved in Catherine's betrayal dead. But he could not legally execute a madwoman. The solution was characteristically Tudor. Parliament passed a special act declaring that insane persons could be executed if their crimes warranted it. The law was changed specifically to permit Lady Rochford's death. Catherine learned of this, and she understood what it meant. If Parliament could change the law to kill Lady Rochford, Parliament could do anything to kill her. There were no protections. There was no escape. The only question was when. The answer came on February 10, 1542. A delegation arrived at Sion Abbey to inform Catherine that she was being moved again. This time, the destination was the Tower of London. The Tower was where traitors went to die. Anne Boleyn had spent her final days there. Lady Jane Grey would spend hers there. The Tower's reputation was earned through centuries of imprisonment and execution, a place where the powerful fell, where queens lost their heads, where the king's displeasure found its ultimate expression. Catherine had known, on some level, that this moment was coming, but knowing and experiencing are different things. When the delegation told her she was going to the Tower, something collapsed inside her, some hope she had not admitted to holding, some belief that perhaps the king would relent. She did not collapse outwardly. By all accounts, she maintained her composure during the journey. She entered the barge that would carry her along the Thames with dignity intact. She passed under London Bridge, where the heads of Dereham and Culpeper still rotted on their spikes, a sight that was certainly deliberate, a final reminder of what her choices had cost. She entered the Tower through the water gate that later generations would call Traitor's Gate. She was escorted to the rooms where she would spend her final days. And she prepared to die. I need to stop here to tell you something about what Catherine Howard experienced in those final days, because the historical sources suggest something remarkable. By all accounts, Catherine did not spend her last days weeping or pleading or protesting her innocence. She spent them preparing. She asked for the block to be brought to her room so that she could practice laying her head upon it. She wanted to die well to face her execution with the dignity that her brief time as queen had taught her to display. This detail has haunted historians for 5 centuries. A teenage girl facing death, asking to rehearse the act of dying so that she would not falter when the moment came. There is something in that detail that speaks to both the horror of her situation and the strength she found within it. She was not going to give her enemies the satisfaction of watching her break. She had broken privately, during the long nights at Sion, during the weeks of uncertainty and isolation, but she had rebuilt herself, and she was going to walk to the scaffold with her head high. The morning of February 13, 1542, was cold. Catherine woke early, or perhaps she had not slept at all. She dressed in the clothes that had been provided for her execution, simple garments that would make the headsman's job easier. She said prayers. She prepared herself for what was coming. Lady Rochford would die the same day. The law that had been changed to permit her execution had done its work. She was lucid enough now, or appeared lucid enough, to understand what was happening. Both women would walk to the same scaffold, would face the same blade, would die within minutes of each other. The execution was scheduled for early morning, before the tower would fill with its daily business. Only a small number of witnesses were permitted, officials whose presence was required by law, guards who maintained order, a few others whose attendance the king had authorized. Catherine walked to the scaffold under her own power. She did not falter. She did not weep. She had practiced this walk, practiced this moment, prepared herself for exactly this. At the scaffold, she was expected to make a speech. This was tradition condemned. Prisoners addressed the crowd, confessed their sins, acknowledged the justice of their punishment, prayed for the king. The speech was not optional. Refusing to give it would have been a final act of defiance that the authorities would not tolerate. Catherine gave her speech. The exact words were not recorded, or rather, different witnesses recorded different versions, and the precise text is uncertain, but the general content is consistent across accounts. She acknowledged that she deserved death. She prayed for the king and for his welfare. She asked those present to pray for her soul. She did not confess to adultery. Even at the end, facing the blade, she maintained that she had not committed the act that justified her death under law. She had been foolish, indiscreet, guilty of conduct unworthy of a queen, but she had not betrayed her marriage vows. The confession she did not give was, perhaps, her final act of resistance, the only thing left that was hers to control. She knelt. She placed her head on the block, the same motion she had practiced, the same position she had rehearsed. The headsman raised his axe. One stroke. It was over. Catherine Howard was dead at 19 years old, having been Queen of England for 16 months, having spent the last 3 months of her life in a waking nightmare that made the death itself almost a relief. Lady Rochford followed her moments later, the same scaffold, the same blade, the same quick death. Their bodies were taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower walls. They were buried near Anne Boleyn, who had died on the same scaffold 6 years earlier. The 3 women who had been Henry VIII's queens, the 2 he had executed, and the one who had died in childbirth, now rested within steps of each other. Henry did not attend the executions. He did not acknowledge them publicly. He moved on, as he always did, to the next phase of his life. Within a year, he would be married again to Catherine Parr, who would survive him. The cycle of queens would continue. Catherine Howard would be remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale. But let us go back, because I have not yet told you the worst part of Catherine Howard's story. The worst part was not the execution. The execution was quick, a few seconds of terror, then nothing. The worst part was what preceded it. The worst part was watching everyone she had ever trusted be destroyed. Manox, interrogated and forced to reveal intimate details of her childhood. Dereham, tortured and executed in the most horrible manner the law prescribed. Culpeper, beheaded for the crime of loving her. Lady Rochford, driven to madness by the pressure of the investigation, executed under a law that was changed specifically to permit her death. The members of her household dismissed, some of them imprisoned, all of them permanently marked by their association with her. Her family, the Howards, one of the most powerful families in England, forced to denounce her, to distance themselves, to participate in her destruction to preserve their own positions. Everyone who had known her, served her, cared for her, all of them swept up in the machinery of Tudor justice, all of them damaged or destroyed by their connection to a 19-year-old girl who had made choices that she could not take back. The worst part was the 3 months of isolation at Sion, not knowing whether she would live or die, not knowing what was happening to the people she loved, unable to help them, unable to save them, unable to do anything except wait and hope and despair. The worst part was learning that Dereham and Culpeper had been executed, that their heads were rotting on London Bridge, that men had died horribly because they had loved her or because she had loved them. The worst part was the journey to the Tower, passing under those rotting heads, knowing that her own death was now inevitable, that the question was only when and how. The worst part was the days in the Tower, practicing how to lay her head on the block, rehearsing her own death so that she could perform it with dignity. The worst part was walking to the scaffold on that cold February morning, knowing that everything she had been, everything she might have become, was ending at 19, that her life had been a brief and terrible arc, from poverty to royalty to this. The execution was not the worst part. The execution was the end. Everything that preceded it was worse. What happened to Catherine Howard deserves to be remembered accurately, not as a simple story of crime and punishment, but as a complex tragedy shaped by forces that a teenage girl could not possibly have controlled. She was born into circumstances that left her vulnerable, raised in a household where supervision was absent and predatory adults had access to children, subjected to sexual attention from her music teacher when she was perhaps 13 years old, attention that she may or may not have understood, that she certainly could not have meaningfully consented to. She formed relationships in that unsupervised environment that would later be used to condemn her. She made choices that reflected her circumstances, her age, her lack of guidance from adults who should have protected her. She was brought to court as a teenager, presented to a king who was looking for a new wife, thrust into a position of impossible pressure and scrutiny. She was expected to be perfect, to be the virgin bride that Henry wanted, the obedient wife that the court required, the careful politician that survival demanded. She was none of these things. She was a teenager with a past, with feelings, with a capacity for affection that got her killed. Was she guilty of adultery? The evidence is ambiguous. Culpeper confessed to intention. She denied that anything physical occurred. The truth probably lies somewhere between their accounts, a relationship that was emotionally intimate, that involved private meetings and expressions of affection, that may or may not have crossed the line into physical betrayal. What is certain is that she was guilty of indiscretion, of failing to understand how carefully she needed to manage her behavior as queen, of trusting people, Lady Rochford, Culpeper himself who could not be trusted, of being, in short, a teenager in a position that demanded adult calculation she did not possess. The punishment for these failures was death, not just her death, but the deaths of Dereham and Culpeper and Lady Rochford. the destruction of careers, reputations, lives, the permanent stain on her family's honor. All because a 19-year-old girl had not been the impossible thing that Henry VIII required her to be. Remember Catherine Howard. Remember not just how she died, but how she lived, and how she was made to suffer before she was permitted to die. Remember the 3 months at Sion, the isolation, the uncertainty, the systematic destruction of everyone she had loved. Remember the heads on London Bridge, Dereham, and Culpeper, rotting reminders of what it cost to love or be loved by the Queen of England. Remember Lady Rochford, driven mad by interrogation, executed under a law that was changed specifically to permit her execution. Remember the morning of February 13, 1542, the cold, the scaffold, the young woman who had practiced laying her head on the block so that she could die with dignity. Remember that she was probably 19 years old. Remember that she had spent her childhood without adequate protection, her adolescence without adequate guidance, her brief time as queen without adequate support. Remember that what happened to her was not justice. It was the operation of a system that treated women as property, that demanded impossible perfection, that destroyed those who failed to meet its requirements. Remember that Henry VIII would marry again within a year, would move on to the next wife, as he had moved on from all the others, would die in his bed, having never faced consequences for anything he had done to the women who had worn his crown. Remember the inequality. Remember the injustice. Remember the 19-year-old girl who died because a king could not tolerate imperfection in his possessions. There is one more thing I need to tell you about Catherine Howard, something that captures the particular horror of her situation more than any other detail. In the days after her arrest, when she was first confined at Hampton Court, when she still believed there might be some way to save herself, Catherine attempted to reach Henry. She broke away from her guards. She ran through the corridors of Hampton Court, trying to reach the king's apartments, trying to speak with him directly, believing that if she could just see him, just explain, just beg for his mercy, he might forgive her. She never reached him. Guards intercepted her in a gallery that connected the queen's apartments to the king's. She screamed. She pleaded. She was dragged back to her confinement, while Henry, who may or may not have heard her screams, who may or may not have been present in his apartments at all, remained unreachable. That gallery is still there. It is called the Haunted Gallery now. Visitors to Hampton Court report hearing screams there, a young woman's voice, desperate, terrified, crying out for a king who would not listen. Whether the ghost is real is a matter of opinion, but the story behind it is historical fact. Catherine Howard did run through those corridors. She did scream for Henry. She was dragged away without reaching him, without speaking to him, without ever seeing him again. He was perhaps 50 feet away. He might have heard her voice. He chose not to respond. That moment, that failed attempt to reach a man who had once loved her, might be the most terrible moment in her entire terrible story. Not the execution, which at least had the mercy of finality, but the gallery, the screaming, the knowledge that her husband was so close and would not help her. That is what happened to Catherine Howard before her execution. That is what was worse than death. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they understand Tudor history from romanticized dramas that portray Henry VIII as a misunderstood romantic. Remember Catherine Howard. Remember the gallery. Remember the screams. Remember